In 2019, about $8 billion went into the digital health space. Look to 2021, that number rose to $30 billion,
Wow.
right? That's a big jump.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Carta Data Minute podcast. My name is Peter. I'm the head of insights at Carta and your host. This is a show where we use data to illuminate what's happening across startups for founders, investors, and employees. And today I was thrilled to be joined by Marissa Bertorelli, a principal investor at Polaris Partners. Marissa invests only into healthcare businesses, and we thought it was an opportune time to discuss healthcare in general because although all venture investing has been down over the last few years, health investing has held up way better than most. Biotech, pharmaceuticals, digital therapeutics are all getting more investment now than they were in 2018 and 2019, even if they're down from their 2021 peaks. In this conversation, Marissa and I touched on a whole host of topics. How the pandemic changed healthcare and healthcare investing in startups in particular. We talked about how AI in healthcare is on the rise and how risky or not risky it might be. We talked about whether founders are wasting their time pitching generalist funds if they have very specialized healthcare companies. Sneak peek, Marissa believes that's actually a very good thing. And we spoke about whether healthcare founders face a double challenge. They have to prove both financial and clinical ROI before they build viable businesses. This was an awesome conversation. Let's jump into it. Marissa, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Peter. I'm really excited to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Welcome into our little podcast studio. I wondered if you could kick us off by just giving us a little bit of background on Polaris and your career as an investor.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So Polaris is an early stage fund focused on healthcare. So we invest broadly across the sector, everything from therapeutics to devices to digital health, healthcare SaSS. So we're very broad in the sector. And I feel lucky to work there because my partners have a wide and varied background. So we have folks who have worked in big pharma. We have physician scientists. We have technology operators. We have folks like myself who have finance backgrounds.
Right.
So really broad set of skills. And we work together as a team to help our companies. We have offices in Boston, New York, San Francisco, and Singapore. Wow. And I feel very lucky to invest in this sector because healthcare is something we can all relate to.
Sure.
Right? So if it's not something you would use or trust, or you would want a grandparent or a loved one to use, it's kind of like, no, we're not doing it.
Yeah.
So that's something I love about being an investor in this space.
Yeah, it kind of makes it feel, just off the bat, a little more personal than a B2B SaaS tool occasionally, that kind of stuff.
I don't want to hate on B2B SaaS.
Love B2B SaaS. I work at a wonderful B2B SaaS company. So yes, I agree.
But yes, it's very personal.
Yeah.
And I think the founders that we work with are very passionate about what they do. And that comes through in the pitch. Or if it doesn't come through in the pitch, it's also a data point, right? So
yeah. And when you say early stage, is that pre-seed, seed, Series A, or do you try to focus on one of those three, or where are you?
Yeah, pretty broad, but generally I would say seed through Series B. And we have some folks in the portfolio that focus on company creation as well. So it can be as early as that.
That's fantastic. So I know I sent over a bunch of charts before this conversation. There's a lot of data that we can dig into, but I thought one of the interesting ones was, at least from what we're seeing on safes and convertible notes like that very early part of the market, healthtech, which used to be call it like 4 or 5 in terms of industries, just like consistently has been climbing in terms of kind of overtook fintech recently as I think the second biggest broad industry in our data there. And I wondered, as an investor, if you're seeing that sort of momentum in health in general from the vantage point that you have.
We definitely are. And I think it probably comes as no surprise that the pandemic changed a lot for all of us. And definitely we saw the impact on the healthcare venture space. So just to kind of like set the stage in terms of high level numbers, in 2019, about $8 billion went into the digital health space. Look to 2021, that number rose to $30 billion,
Wow.
right? That's a big jump. And so I think the impact that the pandemic had was we still all needed to see our physician, right? If something came up with us or a loved one, we still needed to see the doctor. Yeah. But that was able to be facilitated through telemedicine. And that existed pre-pandemic, but I think people realized how frictionless it really was.
No, I used to refuse to do a telemedicine, even if it was an option. I'd be like, what? Why would I do that?
Totally. And now it's like, if I have to go to the doctor's office, I'm like, shoot, okay, that's, an extra step in my day that I have to plan, right? And so even post-pandemic, we're seeing 80% of people are still using telemedicine and want to use telemedicine. And that's even true for the Medicare population. So the 65 plus population, above 65% adoption of telemedicine.
Wow.
And so that trend has continued. I also think the pandemic brought other specialties within healthcare to light. So we can all relate to an older loved one being a bit secluded during the pandemic and not having their community around them just because it wasn't safe. And so mental health and the need for high quality and accessible mental health services was really emphasized. And so we saw a lot of capital flow to that as well. And then one more example, I think we can all relate to setting up our work from home computers and things like that.
Yeah.
And it being like suboptimal in terms of like...
That's a very kind word for it, I think, at the beginning.
Yeah. I had my computer on like a stack of books.
Yep.
And then lo and behold, a few months later, my neck hurts, right?
Sure.
Through the pandemic, we saw a number of companies start to do MSK or musculoskeletal care virtually. So that is really stuck. And while 2022 and 2023 investment levels in digital health have normalized kind of to the $10 to $12 billion state, it's still higher than it was. So curious to see what 2024 holds, but I do think the pandemic changed a lot.
And we just released or are going to be releasing our Q1 data, and it looked like Q1 of 2024 is sort of still that middling slight uptick, like it's not the deluge of capital that we are all maybe hoping for, but nor is it continuing to decline. I wonder if in the health space you're seeing similar or different trends to begin 2024.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think my gut instinct, and this is kind of like more anecdotal than anything, is like the activity has picked up in 2024.
Yep.
People realize that healthcare spend in the U.S. is nearing 20% of GDP,
wow.
And there's a lot of big, hairy problems to solve, right? Yeah. And if any of us have had to have a surgery or, dealt with the prior authorization process, or a clinician like trying to take notes during a office visit and all of the time that takes, we're seeing how applications like AI can really help with those things.
Yep.
And there's a lot of excitement in the sector around that. So anecdotally, I would say, yes, the activity has certainly picked up, and it's something that we're really excited about.
I was actually pretty surprised when I was looking through our recent data on AI companies in particular. Obviously, there's a huge Gen AI portion that's more focused on sales and marketing and content creation and all sorts of, interesting tools that are a little bit either consumer or B2B facing. But there was a large segment of AI in biotech and then AI in health tech in particular, especially at the earliest stages. And I'm wondering, as a layman here, my initial instinct is, isn't there a problem with privacy or trust or like hallucination in those kinds of things within the healthcare space? Or are we talking about different kinds of AI perhaps?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that a lot of investors in the healthcare space are talking about.
Yeah.
And so outside of like, removing the clinician from the loop entirely, which may or may not happen, I think we're, still a bit out from that.
Sure.
There's other applications in healthcare that are seeing a ton of AI investment and advancements today. So things in biotech like target discovery for new drugs, right? For new applications. But then on the digital health side, like I mentioned, we're seeing a lot of these scribing companies that are making physician notes a lot more efficient. Or we're seeing revenue cycle management, like the way hospitals actually bill for the services that they do. We're seeing a lot of AI applications there.
Right.
Or even taking data from like wearable devices, so watches and any like Oura rings and monitors, and actually closing the loop with patients in terms of clinical decision support and clinical decision making. Those things are seeing a lot of investment around AI today.
Are you seeing the same, when I speak to founders, sometimes they get kind of annoyed and say, look, the only thing that's being invested in is AI. If I don't have AI in my deck, I don't get the meeting that I want. Do you think that similar pattern is holding true in health tech, or is it a little less focused?
Oh, gosh, it's tough. I think it's important depending on the business, right? But the fundamentals in healthcare still have to be true, which can be different from traditional SaaS, right? So I think that the service that you're offering, right, needs to have an impact not just on financial ROI for the buyer. So in the case of digital health, the buyer is traditionally a health insurance plan or a provider group or a pharmaceutical company. So it has to have financial value for those stakeholders, but it also has to have clinical value. Yeah. So you have to show that people are using the thing and it's making their health better. And so even with all the AI applications, those things need to be true as well.
Right. It sounds like then building traction for an early stage health tech, let me just say digital therapeutics as an example. When you compare that to the traditional pathways that, how do you find your first 10 customers and how do you get revenue in the door? It sounds like health tech companies have to face the additional hurdle of actually getting people to use the thing even when they're not the buyers.
Totally. Yeah. So when you think about a traditional SaaS company, right, I'm not saying it's easy. It's very hard, right? Yeah. You have to figure out who is the key stakeholder? How do we do the land and expand motion? Right. I think there's an extra layer with healthcare, which is I could land a huge health insurance company as a customer, call it Humana or United, one of the big players. So even if I have that contract in place, I still need to get patients or beneficiaries of that plan to use my product.
Right.
And it can't just be one time. They can't just use it once, right? In most cases, they need to use it multiple times. So you need to see regular and predictable engagement. And then you also have to see clinical outcomes, whether that's, reduced blood pressure or improved A1Cs, depending on what the indication is.
Right.
So it's not just landing the stakeholder at the customer, but then it's figuring out, okay, how do I reach the end patient and get that user adoption?
And do investors into the health space, is it required that an investor in the health space, and again, tell me if I'm showing my ignorance here, are there a ton of investors who do biotech, pharma, digital health, across health? Or is it mostly the go-to-market and the actual motions are so different that you tend to specialize more as a health investor?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think a couple of things. Through the pandemic in the digital health space, we certainly saw more generalist or tech-focused funds entering the space, but it was mostly for products that were consumer-oriented or did not need to go down the FDA pathway.
Like a wearable or something like that?
Yeah, a wearable that didn't need clearance, it was already in the market, or, a digital health application, or, a lot of the Hims and Hers or the 30 Madison, those types of companies.
Which are effectively just bringing pharmacies online, but not actually replacing the doctors in most cases.
There's still clinicians in the loop. A lot of times they're trying to bring specialty care in a telemedicine setting. So we did see a lot of that from more general or tech investors. But then I think on the super specialized biotech side, we didn't see tech investors going from pure tech to biotech, right? So that was too big of a jump.
You can jump from crypto to AI, but it's tough to make it all the way to biotech.
Exactly, yeah.
For sure.
So I think there's still a subset of investors that are purely biotech focused or purely med device focused. Yeah. And then there's multi-stage funds the ones we all know that do kind of everything, right? Sure. So that's the kind of trend in terms of who's investing where, I think.
Do you think that founders, health tech founders in particular, waste time by pitching generalist funds?
That's such a good question. So I would say no. Because I think it's important in the boardroom and from a syndicate to have varied perspectives, right? So I might have a sense if you're bringing a healthcare product to market of who are the health systems you should talk to or who are the payers you should talk to. And I'll get you, an intro to those folks. Right. But if I bring in somebody who's an expert in consumer, they might know then how to solve that question that we were talking about earlier of how do I engage the end patient?
Right.
They might have really thoughtful marketing strategies or in bringing in the right influencer, which we talk about all the time. We're okay, we have a teen mental health product. Who is the right influencer for this? That's a perspective I might have, but I would love to hear what somebody who does more consumer has to say. Right. And so I think it all depends on what milestones your company needs to hit and what type of investor can help you hit those milestones.
Do you think that health tech founders are good at pitching their own products? Then, I mean, not that everyone couldn't use a great influencer, right? That's wonderful. But it's you kind of have to be both scientist in some cases and then mass marketer. And that sounds like a totally different skill set.
Yeah, that's not often the same phenotype, right? But when you find that person who's really passionate about the science and also knows how to sell the product, that's magic. But that doesn't always happen. And you can build a team Or a lot of times we have clinical advisory boards or scientific advisory boards that can help tell the story too. That's really important in the healthcare space. But to your point, it's hard, but not, we have great founders in our portfolio who know how to do both. They're physicians and they're amazing at starting healthcare companies. So it exists, but you make a great point.
It's a unicorn.
It's a unicorn. Yeah,
that's what you're looking for anyways. So
exactly.
It kind of makes sense. How about the idea for a solo versus co-founding teams? We've looked at this data a couple times and it's a question. I'm not sure if it's AI or something else, but I seem to be getting it a lot more often, which is, do I need a co-founder? It's like, there's a lot of stuff out there that says, yes, this is going to be mentally taxing. This is going to be a long journey. You're going to want someone on your side. But there are a cohort of people that I'm meeting now who are saying, look, maybe I can get by with AI tooling and kind of outsourcing some of this, and I can just found this company myself.
People have varied opinions on this. I think, if I were in their shoes, I'd always want a co-founder. I'd love to bounce ideas off somebody.
Yeah.
I think in healthcare, the teams I'm personally most attracted to have both business and clinical expertise.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, I need to have trust in the clinical product that they're putting forth, and I want to know that it's the right thing for patients. Yeah. And it makes a difference to me when there's both kind of that business savvy and that clinical expertise on a team. So a lot of times we see co-founders that have complementary skill sets, and I think that's really beneficial. But you could ask another healthcare investor and they'd say something different. So it's not a one size, like many things, it's not a one size fits all.
Right. Do you find that there are founders in the health tech space who start as solo and then find that somewhere in the early part of the journey, they kind of need to make the switch to co-founder? Maybe it's, I raised a little bit of capital, but in order to really pour fuel on this fire, it would make more sense for me to find a co-founder later on.
Yeah, we do. I think that happens. But a lot of times, the work that we do is coming out of academia. And so like the scientific or clinical co-founder is kind of front and center a lot of times from the beginning.
Right.
But that there's different situations.
And are they serial founders? Like the other trend that's been both good and bad recently in the pandemic, or coming out of this venture downturn, I should say, is that there seems to be this turn from funds, tech, generalist, et cetera, back towards repeat founders, which is, I can understand it, right? It's a less risky proposition if someone has had a successful exit to back them again, but it oftentimes leaves first-time founders out, and those first-time founders tend to be more diverse, different kinds of people. So as an ecosystem, I'm kind of wary of that trend, but are there a lot of serial founders in healthcare who just kind of take products and do the cycle again and again?
Yeah, actually at Polaris, so the fund has been around since the mid-90s, and there's 40 entrepreneurs in our portfolio that we've backed more than once.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we do have a repeat entrepreneur thesis, and we have seen, especially like the scientific or clinical founders do found, like they're, at MIT or Harvard or UCSF or Stanford, and they're founding multiple companies, right? But like we've come across great first-time CEOs that have amazing ideas. And I think knowing where you need to pull in that expertise is just as important as what you can bring to the table. Right? That's so important. And so we certainly fund both, but people that recognize the deep expertise that you need to start and run and build a successful healthcare company is really important.
Yeah. And are they... Sorry, we're leaving the charts aside for now because I'm loving this part of the conversation.
Yay.
But the exit strategy in healthcare. You're investing kind of seed through Series B. One, are you talking about exit strategy with these founders yet, or is it always yes, you're trying to IPO? Or two, if there is a talk of exits, what is the typical where does the balance lie between acquired versus IPOing versus other kinds of exits?
So I think from my conversations with my tech investor friends, it is a little bit of a different flavor. Of course, we would love to see all of our companies IPO and be successful, but I think we're realizing that there's massive healthcare companies that are very acquisitive. So like I mentioned, United Optum, they are very acquisitive, right? There's a number of big companies. Look at Microsoft and Nuance, right?
Sure.
So there's great exits where it's not an IPO situation. And so we are always thinking about that, but it might not be, IPO or bust like some other tech investors might feel.
Yes, yeah. And I think that founders sometimes get scared off they hear varied advice as to whether or not they should put, say, exit strategies in a deck or something and say well, then are you fully committed to the long term? And it kind of feels like they get it from both sides.
I love to see vision in a deck. Like I love to see Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, right? But I don't necessarily need to, we can talk about that at some point, but I don't need to necessarily see like this is the exit strategy in the deck. I love to see vision though.
Okay.
So a lot of times in healthcare, we'll see like one product for one patient population. And at Polaris and a lot of other, like we like to invest in platform companies. So whether that's a therapeutic platform where multiple drugs can be discovered, or on the digital health side, is there multiple patient populations or multiple indications or disease areas that you can address?
Right.
And so we need to see that broader platform vision, and that, you know, suggests there is a pretty big exit on the table.
So is Act 2 and Act 3 generally broadening to different patient populations with separate drugs or separate therapeutics?
It depends. It can be, it can be a couple of things. It could be, hey, we're going to start selling into commercial payers, so health insurance companies, and then we're going to go to self-insured employers, so big companies that take risk for their health insurance plans and for their employees. So I'm now going to go sell Walmart and Amazon my products. So it could be who is the end buyer, and that's how you're getting revenue diversification, or it could be, hey, I'm treating diabetes today, but I also want to think about mental health because there's a lot of comorbidities in that space, right? So it can depend, but having that vision to where are we going next is critical.
Right. Yeah. So more of the Parker Conrad, multiple products at the same time kind of approach, or at least thinking about it early
on.
Yeah.
And we like to see that vision, right? And it has to be balanced with focus too, which is a hard thing to strike,
I'm
right?
sure that entrepreneurs love when they hear that. Yes.
Yes.
Big vision, but also focus.
Yeah, it's so annoying.
Like,
you're driving me nuts. I know, I drive me nuts. But you get what I'm saying. It has to be visionary, but you need to know what the short-term playbook is too.
Yeah. So actually on the idea of the short-term there, we were talking a little bit off mic about the differences in traction, or like what founders need to deal with as early stage health tech versus their founder friends who might be early stage SaaS.
Totally.
So like what sort of traction points might a healthcare founder be walking in with that are completely divorced from, the target revenue stuff that you hear in SaaS?
Yeah, that's probably the number one question I get, especially with really early stage companies, is what proof points
what are you looking for? Right.
And that's a totally valid question.
Yep.
But the answer is, there's no one size fits all.
Sure.
And what I will say in healthcare...
But if there was a one size fits all, what would it be?
Exactly. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but healthcare companies need to think both about financial ROI and clinical ROI. And I think that's a little bit different than traditional SaaS. So when thinking about financial ROI, it could be how many hours am I saving a clinician? Mm-hmm. Or if I'm selling a product that's going to help with the Medicare community, so the 65 plus community, am I preventing emergency room admissions? What is the ROI on that?
Yep.
And then there's also the clinical ROI. So we've, worked with an academic medical center, and we ran a small study. It could be, 20 patients, but we saw within those 20 patients over 3 or 6 or 9 months that they actually had improved healthcare outcomes. So when you come to the table, you have to have not just a value prop in terms of the financial ROI, but also the clinical ROI. And I think that's a little bit different in terms of the traction that you're requiring of a traditional SaaS company.
I think it's a whole other layer.
It is a whole other layer. And then I think that plays into the sales cycles that we tend to see in healthcare. Right. They can be longer than traditional SaaS. Not always, but it's not abnormal to see a sales cycle in health tech that's 18 to 24 months.
Mm.
And it might
even at the seed stage of these companies.
Oh yeah, and even after you've shown, a clinical pilot success.
Right.
Pilots are, we hope to have enough clinical data and a compelling enough story that we go right to contract, but a lot of times we'll have to do a short pilot to prove both that financial and clinical ROI first.
And do you help those companies run that pilot, or can be as additive there?
We're definitely
rather the entrepreneur have run it before you get into conversations.
It depends. Again, it depends on. For us, we're a little bit later, so usually we'll at least see a small study first,
right?
And that's not always the case, right?
Yep.
There's certainly exceptions, but there's investors that are going to be side by side too, thinking about what academic medical centers or what health systems or what payer partners can we work with, and we do that a lot too, to think about putting a really thoughtful study together.
What about the angel investor community around health tech? How's that different or the same? You know, I'm thinking in particular here about location. There's so much made of coming to Silicon Valley and being in these clusters. And I think while there's a lot of tales to that, one of the biggest things that's distinct is just the density of angel investors in this area. Mm-hmm. So how do health tech companies early on think about angels?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of geography, San Francisco, of course, is big, but Boston's also really big, right? Because you have Mass General Brigham, you have Harvard and the Broad and MIT. You have a lot of, healthcare in Boston.
Right.
And we're seeing more and more health tech in New York, too.
Yeah.
So I think, and even abroad, we're seeing a lot of biotech come up in Singapore, too. And so I think it's a little bit different where there's a lot of different healthcare hubs. I mean, Tennessee, huge healthcare hub, right? So it's not just Silicon Valley. Of course, there's a ton going on here. There's great institutions here and PIs.
Yep.
But I think there's other pockets where there's a ton of activity as well.
Do you have to interface with the universities for whom these researchers work all the time? Like, what's that relationship like?
It's fun. I mean, I love being on campuses. There's so much like hope and joy of being on
a college campus.
Right?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
And so I am fortunate enough that I do get to spend time on, MIT's campus, and I didn't go there. Sure. I don't have any right to be there, but I get to go in and talk to different researchers and say,
right,
what cool thing are you working on to improve healthcare?
Yeah.
And that's so fun.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
What are there maybe don't need to shout out particular schools, but are there ways that schools are doing a really good job of allowing researchers to do this sort of commercial work as well? Or programs that you know about that are pretty interesting or different in that space?
Yeah, I think and it's not just the institutions I mentioned. I mean, I think a lot of schools are figuring out how to encourage more entrepreneurship. I think it's what I found is especially for the students that are at the school that want to be entrepreneurial, right? Mm-hmm. They have a science background or a CS background, and they want to start a company. There's this balance they're trying to strike with introducing them to the world of venture capital, but they also want to make sure that they graduate, right? And there's always going to be people who leave, right? We know those examples, but I think the universities are trying to figure out, especially with AI, right? And I think you talked about this on another podcast, right? You don't need a ton of people to start a company now because of those tools.
Yeah.
And at MIT, I think it's half of the students are now doing computer science and have interest in that area. So I think they're all trying to strike that balance, but we've definitely seen a ton of universities implement new entrepreneurship programs, which is really exciting.
Do you see that those founders, as they come out, well, I guess the founders that you're investing in general, are they just trying to keep their teams much smaller than they used to? Are they coming in with a lot lower headcounts?
It depends on the company, right? I think a lot of the companies we see, even if they're trying to develop a model or an AI-driven model, a lot of times you need to generate the data to feed that model.
Right.
And so sometimes that will require actually a higher headcount at the beginning. And then a lot of our companies that are tech-enabled service companies, so they're actually providing healthcare services to patients.
Right.
Sure, you could use AI to have fewer clinicians, but you're still going to need clinicians. So again, a little bit of a difference there too, where yes, I imagine, I don't know the data, but I imagine you're seeing health tech companies get smaller perhaps, but they're probably still larger.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have that data or if you looked at it, but it would be interesting to look at.
I think that it's not necessarily that companies are getting smaller. Well, a lot of layoffs, of course, happened throughout private tech over the last 18 months. So in that sense, yes, companies have shrunk, but it's more that I think they're just focused on the unit of revenue per employee. Is just that metric has just become so much more in vogue than it was in 2020 and 2021. And that can drive a lot of decisions across the company.
Totally. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So is that I was going to ask a little, well, we touched on it a little bit earlier about AI in healthcare, but I was going to ask about regulatory sort of, I guess the real question is, can you found a health tech company without being a scientist? How deep in this space do you need to be in order to be a good founder here?
I think we see a lot of people who come from other industries who are bringing in their expertise from some other field, or they have a family member that was impacted by a disease and they really want to be founders in that space. And I think that is great.
Yeah.
And I would encourage that. And I think the best founders, like I said earlier, just know that they need to bring certain skill sets around the table, and they're very open to what they know and what they don't know. So if they're, an AI expert, they know they can handle that part of the equation, and they're going to bring a rock star clinician in that disease area to the table. So I would definitely encourage, frankly, we need people with amazing tech expertise to solve the massive problem that is the U.S. healthcare system.
Right.
We spend more as a country than any other country and have worse care outcomes. That's the reality. Right. So I would love to see more innovative tech founders come and start a company in the healthcare space.
It's a pitch to all
There's
the founders.
the pitch.
This is the end.
There's
Loved
the pitch.
it. Are the health tech startups actually, you just spoke of shortages on the founder side. Are there shortages of clinicians as in of all kinds across the US that we're trying to solve?
Yes.
Okay.
So that's probably the biggest issue that health systems are facing right now, is that, truly the heroes in the pandemic were clinicians, right? They didn't have the luxury of what I had working from home in my sweatpants. That wasn't happening. Definitely. They were going in and putting themselves and their families at risk and taking care of people. And, as expected, there was burnout.
Yeah.
And so health systems, I don't know the exact statistic, but call it north of 30% turnover of their nursing staff.
Wow.
It's a big problem.
That's compared to a historical average of much less than
that. And there's also a large set of nurses that are going to be retiring. Yeah. And that's not just nurses, that's physicians too. We are going to have a massive shortage of primary care physicians if we don't do something about it. And so I'm always looking for, is there ways to use different clinicians in a model that's more efficient? So in an area where I was using a physician, could I use a nurse practitioner or a PA? Right. Or are there tools that we can leverage that the physician or the clinician likes to use and makes them more efficient?
Yep.
Or how do we get people trained to be a clinician and enter the workforce? Right. And so those are things that are top of mind for funds and also, our end customers, the health systems, the payers. Everybody is, laser focused on how do we solve this labor problem.
Yeah. Any big
aha moments? My colleague... Coming soon. My colleague and I were having a conversation about how the EMR, the electronic medical record, is probably going to be transformed by AI. Epic is a company that is dominant in the space. Yep. But what else can you embed into Epic to make it easier to use, faster to use? We can bill faster. People can write notes faster. Right. So I think those are some of the things that we're seeing.
How do healthcare investors think about robots?
That's a good question.
Are you investing into robots now?
We are. Surgical robotics is a really interesting area.
Oh, cool.
So we're invested in that space. I think it could really transform how it already is transforming how surgery, for example, is done.
Yeah.
We invested in a company called Savado that's enabling remote robotic surgery. So it's another example of how telemedicine is transforming healthcare, right? So the concept that the surgeon could be in Boston and completing a surgery somewhere else through the use of network infrastructure and surgical robotics. It's pretty cool.
And though there's not too much lag or latency that you would actually trust the movements from, miles and miles away.
Exactly. That's one of the proof points that we're going to have to show is the latency question. Right. But I think it's, we believe it's doable. And it's a great example of how telemedicine and the wave that happened during the pandemic is now powering future innovation. It's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. Maybe some silver linings from the pandemic finally.
Yeah.
That's
lots
awesome.
of silver linings. I wanted to make sure when we had this conversation, there's so many cool things happening in healthcare.
Yeah.
And while it's, like I said, there's a ton of challenging problems and regulatory hurdles and long sales cycles there's still so much opportunity.
Right. Yeah. Why be an entrepreneur if you're not tackling the thorniest problems, right?
Totally.
Yeah. This is great. Marissa, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. This was fun.
It was a ton of fun.